What's up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you each and every Monday and Thursday by the Hockey News. I am your host, of course, Emma Lingan. I cover the Nashville Predators here at the Hockey News. I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Michael Augello, who covers the Buffalo Sabres here for us at the Hockey News. And as always, we've got lots to talk about today. But before we do dive into today's bite-sized storylines from around the NHL, do want to let you know that we are brought to you by our good friends at Sticks.com. Hey, hockey players, why drop a fortune on your sticks when you can snag pro-level composite sticks at Sticks.com? That's Stix.com. These all black beauties are made for sniping, saucing, and shutting it down, all while looking sharp on the ice. And the best part is that prices start at just $85.13 US for a 3-pack. Yep, you heard that right. Elite sticks without the elite price. Hit up Stix.com. Again, that's Stix.com now and gear up without the markup. Let's go. Mike, Leon Draisaitl doesn't seem to have missed a beat. He returned, to the Oilers lineup on Saturday against the Calgary Flames, finished with 2 goals and an assist, including the OT winner. He became the first player to reach 50 goals this season with that OT winner. He's now at 51. So with Connor McDavid still out of the lineup, Draisaitl obviously doing Draisaitl things, do you think that this could just really effectively put an end to any sort of debate as far as who the Hart Trophy winner could be this season if Draisaitl continues to lead the team like this for the rest of the year?
I think it ends the debate in terms of who's going to get votes from the Edmonton Oilers, because McDavid's had a great year, but Draisaitl has had a year where he's leading the league in goals and he's been dominant. But I think he'll be a top 3 finalist for the Hart. But I look at the year that Kucherov is having in Tampa Bay. I look at Nathan MacKinnon following up his MVP season with another MVP potential season. And you can't ignore, even though they say it's not a goaltending award, Connor Hellebuyck and what he's doing in Winnipeg. I mean, we've had instances in the past where Dominik Hasek won in Buffalo and Jose Theodore won when he was in Montreal. So it is possible for a goaltender to win the award, and Hellebuyck is having such a dominant year that I think it's possible he could be a finalist. But Draisaitl is having a great year, but I think the fact that Edmonton could finish in 3rd in the Pacific Division will also be a factor. I mean, you can say, he's having a great year, but Vegas and Los Angeles finished ahead of him if they do. So I think all those things will be factors. I think he'll be a finalist, but I don't know if he's a favorite to win the award.
Well, as you mentioned, he's essentially already sort of run away with the Rocket Richard Trophy for this season. I think the next behind Draisaitl in goals is William Nylander, and I think he's behind him by about 9 goals. So definitely going to be winning some hardware at some point this season, I think. But yeah, still an interesting race at the top there for the Hart Trophy. All right, let's move on to Chicago, because we've seen a lot of prospect signings this week as the NCAA tournament gets underway. The Blackhawks signed 2 of their top prospects over the weekend after the Minnesota Golden Gophers were eliminated from the tournament. So they signed Sam Rinzel and Oliver Moore. So looking at these 2 guys, Rinzel has definitely added some size on defense. He projects as sort of a top 6 defenseman. Oliver Moore maybe projects more as sort of a 3rd line forward. But looking at these guys, which of these 2 do you think has a better chance of being an NHL regular next year?
I'll take the neither category, and that's not a statement on their talent, which I think is in abundance. It's just a question of, and we saw it this year with the Blackhawks and the struggles that they've had. Do you really want to throw a couple 20-year-olds to the Wolves? And I think what the Blackhawks did with Korchinski and Levshunov, and to a lesser extent Nazar, who's played half a season in the NHL. They haven't put him in the NHL completely and not had them go back and forth between Rockford and the NHL. They've sort of spoon-fed them into the league. So I don't think either one of Moore or Rinzel will be everyday NHLers. I think they'll probably follow that approach. But if you ask me which one has a better chance of being an everyday player, I would say probably Rinzel, because Moore, if their desire is for him to be a center, you have Bedard, you have Ryan Donato, and you have Nazar. And you could move one of them to the wing, but I don't know if you can move two of them to the wing. And it depends on whether you want to develop Moore as a number 2 center or a number 3 center. I think that sort of, learning curve fits better in the American Hockey League. Learn how to play better defensively, learn how to win faceoffs, get stronger. It's tough to do that at the NHL level. Rinzel, with the obvious departure of Seth Jones, Rinzel's a right shot defenseman and a big right shot defenseman. I think the path is clear for him to get playing time. Whether that's the right move and defensemen take longer to mature at the NHL level, I don't know. All I know is I think both of them would benefit from some significant American Hockey League time.
Well, regardless of when or how often we see these guys in the NHL next season, it is still a pretty clear sign that, the Blackhawks are taking another step in their rebuild. So whether it's next season or beyond, this is going to be sort of the young core group that they're going to be going with beyond this year. So interesting group to keep an eye on as they develop through their system. Another NCAA prospect, teammate of both of those guys at Minnesota, Jimmy Snuggerud, has signed with the St. Louis Blues. He was obviously their top NCAA prospect. He led Minnesota with 24 goals and 51 points in 40 games this season. So averaged over a point per game in 3 seasons with Minnesota. And he's going to be joining the Blues practice, reporting to St. Louis and jumping right into it. So he could suit up for the team this week. Obviously, St. Louis in the middle of a late playoff push here. And Snuggerud's a guy that we've talked about before on the show, Michael. How effective and impactful do you think he can be joining the Blues down the stretch and then potentially even in the playoffs?
He could be impactful, but you have to take into consideration where the Blues are right now. They're 6 points up for the final wildcard spot. They're tied with Minnesota. So they're safe, but not too safe that you want to risk sort of putting in a player with no NHL experience. And they've been absolutely scorching since the Four Nations. They're 15-2-2 since the Four Nations. So do you really want to mess with the chemistry? I think you want to get him in the lineup, maybe if you put him in a fourth line role, but he's not a fourth line player. He's somebody who probably plugs in at least a third line and maybe even a second line. So it's debatable about what they should do with Jim Montgomery, whether they want to plug him in, whether they want to get him acclimated, and whether he has a significant role going down the stretch and in the playoffs. I mean, it's nice to have that option, and I think they'll exercise it, but I think they'll maybe wait a little bit, practice a few times, and then maybe once they clinch, then they can give him some playing time and then see what he is like and how close to being ready for what is always a challenge in the Stanley Cup playoffs.
Yeah, as you mentioned, sort of a delicate balancing act here in terms of when and where and how to deploy these kids once they do get to the NHL level. I know in Nashville, at least, another Minnesota player, Matthew Woods, signed with the Predators. He's probably going to be making his NHL debut even sooner than expected due to injuries to Colton Sissons and Jonathan Marchessault. So it really does depend by player, by team, by situation. Regardless, though, exciting to see these names, all these young guys signing with their teams and moving forward. Mike, I want to talk about someone who you are very familiar with, for better or for worse, in Buffalo, Jack Eichel. He has, of course, had an incredible season for the Vegas Golden Knights this year. He's fourth in the league in scoring. He's got a career high 93 points in 72 games. Of course, has the chance to reach 100 points for the first time in his career, and there's still 9 games left in the season. So Eichel is also second in the league in plus minus among forwards. So he's got a plus 26 rating, which people are divided on how much that stat means, but still seems pretty significant. Do you think that we already talked about the Hart Trophy earlier with guys like Draisaitl and McKinnon and Hellebuck and Kucherov, but do you think that Jack Eichel should be in this conversation and potentially maybe even in the Selke conversation with that plus minus that he has?
I think he should be in consideration for both, but as you mentioned, the 4 names I think are probably ahead of him. And in terms of the Selke, there's always, the usual suspects. There's Cirelli and Barkov and Rupe Hintz and Mitch Marner, and they've all, either been finalists or winners. So it's tough to break into that. He could be 5th in both categories. He's having a fantastic year. But I'm sure he'll be less concerned about the Hart or the Selke and more concerned about a second Stanley Cup ring. And the way Vegas is right now, if they get Shea Theodore back, and I don't believe he's back from the wrist injury from the Four Nations, once they get him back, then they're really, they're really at a certain point there where they're at full strength. Then, I think they're, coming out of the Pacific, which I think is a benefit for them because the Central is so strong. Them facing the wild card and then facing the winner of LA Edmonton is a much easier path than going through Winnipeg, Dallas, and Colorado. So, I'm sure, Eichel is going to be focused on a long and deep playoff run.
All right. Well, we've already mentioned him a couple times. So let's talk a little bit more today about Nikita Kucherov, because he, of course, has had a great season. He's got 109 points already in 69 games played. So obviously this is another dominant season for him, and what has been a number of dominant seasons. So he's ranked second in points per game, only to Connor McDavid since the 2021-22 season. He's also got the highest points per game average of any Russian-born player ever in the NHL, and he's 6th on the all-time scoring list for Russian-born players. So, of course, we've all been focused, and rightly so, on Alex Ovechkin. He's getting all of the hype right now for chasing Gretzky's all-time goal record, but it's almost caused Kucherov and other guys to sort of fall by the wayside here. Where do you think, again, obviously Kucherov not as far into his career as Ovechkin is, but by the time all is said and done, where do you see him ranking among, all-time Russian-born NHL players?
I mean, at this current rate, he's going to be one of the best, but I don't foresee anybody being better than Ovechkin because Ovechkin's going to break the record. And, everybody considered Gretzky the best, even though I'm of the generation who still believes Bobby Orr was more impactful to the game than Gretzky. But, you have to factor in a certain Russian generation where, you talk Kazatonov and Fedosov and Tretiak and the KLM line, going back to and then, the next generation, which was Fedorov and Bure and Mogilny, and then Datsuk and Ovechkin and Malkin. I mean, he fits in that group. As a question of whether he's the best, I mean, it's debatable. I think, in the end, if he, wins a couple more Stanley Cups, Ovechkin won 1. And if he wins, he's won 2 already. And if he wins 3 or 4, then, that might be the tipping factor there. But I still think, and in the end, unless he gets relatively close to Ovechkin, Ovechkin is always going to be the number one alpha dog when it comes to Russian players.
All right. Well, we are still a few weeks away from the Stanley Cup playoffs starting here, but the CHL playoffs have already started. So we've got the OHL, the QMJHL, the WHL playoffs all started this week. So, of course, a lot of the NHL's top drafted and undrafted prospects playing in these games right now. So, looking across these playoff races, Mike, is there any particular players or teams even that really stand out to you that you're interested in or you're looking forward to making some noise in the playoffs?
Well, in the OHL, the London Knights are always a focal point. They're the preeminent franchise. They had the best record in the OHL at 55-11-2. A couple first round draft pick defensemen and Sam Dickinson and Oliver Bonk. Easton Cowan was the CHL Player of the Year, OHL MVP. I mean, he whatever award, he basically won every single one of them last year. And this year, he went to the World Junior, and he didn't have as big a season. It's sort of tough to top the type of year that he had last year. And, really, he didn't get a great chance to make the Maple Leafs this season. So, I think in a perfect world, he would have ended up in the American Hockey League rather than back at junior. He really didn't have much to prove. But they're up 2-0 on Owen Sound in the first round of the OHL playoffs. So it'll be interesting to see how deep, how far they go. In the WHL, Medicine Hat, who had the best record in the league, they're the ones that I'm sort of focused on. It's easy to pick teams with the best records, but Gavin McKenna, who I think everybody believes is the number one overall pick, not in the upcoming draft in Los Angeles, but in the 2026 draft. He's already drawing comparisons, and I hate making comparisons. He's the next Bedard, he's the next McDavid. No, he's Gavin McKenna. We don't know what he's going to be, but he looks like he's going to be great. But that's the focus. I mean, he at a year away from his draft year, he is dominating the Western Hockey League. So again, it's whether he can continue that in his run. I think he had 97 points this season. Whether he can make a run through the WHL playoffs and to the Memorial Cup.
Yeah, I'm with you on the Medicine Hat train. They're a fun team to watch, very exciting. You mentioned McKenna, of course, but even Oasis Weisblatt has been very exciting to watch through his development. Really exciting young player in the Capitals system right now, but he, I believe, scored a hat trick in game one of the series where they shut out Swift Current. So they've got a lot of weapons on that team besides just Gavin McKenna, I think, too. So it makes them very fun to watch. All right, let's hop back to the NHL here and talk about Ryan McDonagh in Tampa Bay, of course, longtime defenseman, honored over the weekend for reaching 1,000 games played in the NHL. Two-time Stanley Cup champ with Tampa. He's 34 years old. He's having a solid season in his second stint with Tampa. So he's got 28 points in 73 games. He's second in the league in plus minus at plus 40. And he's one of the most, I think, of course, I've seen him play in Nashville over the last couple seasons. I think he's kind of underrated as far as, sort of your old school stay at home shutdown defenseman. But where do you think he sort of ranks among the defensemen in the NHL? Maybe not just right now, but sort of his generation, his era.
I've always been a fan of Ryan McDonagh. I honestly think he's a borderline Hall of Famer, even though he doesn't have the offensive statistics. He's had a couple 40-plus point seasons, but he's sort of been underrated even from the very beginning. People don't realize he was a first-round pick of the Montreal Canadiens, and he got traded to the Rangers in the Scott Gomez deal. Do you think the Canadians would like to take that one back? And he had a number of fantastic years with the Rangers, and then got traded with JT Miller to Tampa, which was a completely one-sided deal. And then he won his 2 cups in Tampa. And then we know that the only reason he was traded to Nashville was cap problems with Tampa. They wanted to keep him. They just simply couldn't. And, I mean, Emma, you saw him in Nashville. It wasn't like he took a step back. He was the solid two-way defenseman he always was. And I was a little taken aback by the fact that he ended up back in Tampa. I was a little surprised that happened, but you can see what he's doing right now. And they brought him back. They traded Sergachev out. And I think he's one of the main reasons why Tampa is the success that they have been this year.
Yeah, I think the whole way that it went down, where he essentially requested a trade back to Tampa, said to Barry Trotz, hey, if there's any way you can make this happen, that's where my family and I want to be. It kind of suggests that there was probably some sort of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge agreement in place when he was traded to Nashville in the first place. But that being said, like you said, didn't take a step back at all. I think that, like you said, right or wrong, for better or for worse, a lot of times in today's NHL, defensemen get sort of evaluated based on their offensive ability. And he is not a high scoring defenseman, never has been. That's not his game. And I can tell you for sure, Nashville has definitely missed him. Their blue line has been a mess since he left, but definitely, a really important part of the blue line in Tampa, but also just a really solid leader, solid locker room guy. I think means, very, very popular among his teammates in Tampa and in Nashville.
One of the reasons why I've always been in favor of 2 awards, the Norris Trophy maybe being an offensive award, and then say the Rod Langway Trophy as a defensive defenseman or two-way defenseman. He's the highest he ever finished in the Norris race was 8th. And that I was baffled when I did a little research on that, as respected as he is as a defenseman and as prominent as he's been over his, 14, 15-year career, the fact that he only finished, the highest that he finished was 8th in the Norris was, I shook my head. So I think they should consider having 2 awards. And if they had it in the past, I think he probably would have won at least once, maybe twice, the Rod Langway Award.
I agree with you there for sure. All right, let's move on to Anaheim. Mason McTavish, really solid second half with the Ducks. He's got 29 points in 35 games dating back to January 1st. He's already got career highs in goals with 20 and 45 points as well. He's up for a contract extension this season. Looking at where the Ducks are, they have the cap space, and kind of looking at what McTavish has done this year, how much do you think he's going to be earning next season, if you had to take a guess?
Well, the fact that Anaheim has so much cap space might scare off teams to potentially sign him to an offer sheet, because they'll just match whatever they offer unless it's patently absurd. He scored 20 goals this year. I think more impressive is his plus minus went from -23 to +5. So he's improved defensively. I tried to use a comparable player, a comparably aged player, as sort of a template to what I think he might get. And Dylan Guenther's contract with Utah, which was 8 years at $7.1 million, is sort of roughly, and I think he'll get more than that because the cap's going up. Guenther is a winger and McTavish is a center. So if Pat Verbeek, and I would recommend it highly to get him signed for as long as you possibly can, meaning 8 years, I would say he probably gets in the $8 million, $8.25 million range. And I think maybe if the cap continues to go up as we expect it to, it might be higher than that. But I would say conservatively 8.25.
Okay. Yeah, we're kind of on the same wavelength. Definitely seems like a guy that you don't sign him to a bridge deal. He's a guy that you want to lock down long term. And I was kind of thinking 7.5 to 8.5. So I think we're on the right track there. Will be interesting to keep an eye on what happens in Anaheim with McTavish. All right, let's go back up north. John Tavares has led the NHL in goals during the month of March. He's got 13 in 15 games played. He's on pace to have his first season finishing over a point per game since the 2018-2019 season when he first joined the Maple Leafs. So obviously so much focus in Toronto on Nylander, Marner, Matthews, and how they're going to perform in the playoffs. Always a hot button issue. Are we overlooking the fact that perhaps Tavares could be the X factor for the Leafs in the playoffs this year? Or do you think this is sort of just a flash in the pan right now?
Well, I think he's definitely putting up these numbers. There's some impetus there because the contract is up. He's clearly let it be known to the Maple Leafs he wants to stay in Toronto. The Matthew Knies RFA and the Marner UFA scenarios, I think, have contributed to the fact that the Leafs have said they're not going to sign him until after the season because they want to maintain some flexibility. I mean, honestly, next to Nylander, who, as you mentioned earlier, is second in the league behind Draisaitl, he's been streaky. Tavares has just been consistent, and he's got 35 goals. He's put up his best year since the first season when he scored 47. He's been, when Matthews was out, he was the number one center, and he carried the freight, and he's been fantastic on faceoffs. I mean, he's just been, Marner has been streaky at times. Matthews has had his injury issues. Nylander is hot and cold like every scorer is. Tavares has just been steady and stable. Now, there's been speculation about what he's going to get on a new contract. The fact that he has let it be known and publicly known, I want to stay in Toronto, may work against him, but I don't think he cares about that. I think he wants to stay in Toronto. And if it's at the cost of maybe $500,000 to $1 million less, I think he's prepared to pay that price. I think he's going to, they're very respectful of him. He's their former captain. He's a leader on that team. He's dependable. He can move from center to the wing when he starts to slow down a little more. But I think it's going to get done. I just don't think it's going to get done until after the season. And I don't think, he was the one who scored the game-winning goal in overtime for the one series that they've won in the last 8 years. So I don't think dependability is the issue with John Tavares. With Matthews, Marner, and Nylander, it is.
Well, speaking of the playoffs, and I want to wrap up here today, looking at the teams that are likely going to be in the playoffs at this point, a couple races still to be decided there. But for the ones that we know, which playoff teams do you think, looking at, let's start in the East, since you're more familiar with the Eastern Conference, which playoff teams that currently have guys who are injured, which ones do you think could be the most impacted due to those injuries that they're dealing with? So obviously, we talked about earlier in the West, the Oilers have McDavid. He's of course an X factor for them if he is still injured by the time playoffs come around. But what are some examples do you think in the East of guys who could really make or break their team's playoff chances when it comes to those injuries?
Okay, in the East, they have one for each division. Florida and the Atlantic is a definite. They got Marchand back, but Tkachuk, we know how much of a monster he is. We know how much of a motivational player he is. They ride on his emotion and his physicality. And again, for those, and I raise my hand right here, for those who are against the Four Nations, Matthew Tkachuk's injury in playing for the U.S. if the Panthers do not win the Stanley Cup or do not make a long run and he is debilitated because of that, then you could say the Four Nations, the ownership, Vinny Viola and Bill Zito, the GM of the Panthers, will not be a fan of the Four Nations. And you also have to factor in, even though it's not an injury, Aaron Ekblad being suspended for 20 games has affected that team as well. His absence is extremely noticed. In the Metro, it's the New Jersey Devils by a long shot. I mean, losing Jack Hughes, even though Cody Glass has played well in his place, he's not Jack Hughes. And Dougie Hamilton, I still don't even know whether he's going to make it back. We're not 100% sure whether that's the case. But the loss of their best defenseman and their best center, I mean, it's fatal. So I think they had a chance to come out of the East. Now I think they have next to no chance. What about the West?
Yeah, agree with you on both of those fronts. In the West, got to stick with the Central Division for both. I think, you mentioned before the Central is a juggernaut with how competitive the top of the division is. So I think when you look at teams like Dallas and Minnesota, I'll start with Minnesota because obviously the loss of Kirill Kaprizov has been massive for them. And he really is the X factor that at this point determines whether they even make it into the playoffs, because they have fallen to that second wild card spot. Again, still some time. But he really is their offense. And Minnesota's also been dealing with some other injuries as well. Kaprizov is the one that I think you really just can't replace a guy like that. So that's going to hurt Minnesota. And we talked about this on a previous episode, but Dallas, I think, is really going to be hurting without Miro Heiskanen if they don't have him back, because, offensively, Dallas is very deep, very talented. Of course, they could still get Tyler Seguin back, which would be, of course, a boost to them. But in my opinion, I don't think the absence of Seguin is going to hurt them as much as the absence of Heiskanen. They are pretty weak on the back end beyond their top two defensemen. And, it kind of just, they get exposed by elite scoring teams. And obviously you need solid defense to make a deep playoff run there. So I think Heiskanen is going to be critical for Dallas if they are going to make a deeper playoff run this year. So will be interesting to see. Like you said, a few of these guys, we don't actually know if or when they're coming back in time for the playoffs. So could definitely be changing a lot of the narratives here around the playoff teams as we get closer to that point. But for now, we will just have to wait and see. Of course, that is going to do it for today's episode of the Wraparound. Thank you, as always, Michael, for joining me, talking some hockey today. Thank you again to Stix.com, of course, for sponsoring us. We will be back with an all-new episode on Thursday. We'll see you then.